Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Data Mapping Best Practices for GDPR Compliance. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items to cover first. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording within 48 hours of the conclusion of the presentation. Secondly, feel free to submit your questions at any time. We will cover those at the end. You can either use the chat box or the question and answer feature as well. And if we don't have time to cover your question, we will follow up via email to make sure we get you an answer. Next up, a disclaimer. The opinions discussed in today's presentation are those of the individual and do not represent the firms, companies, entities that they may be affiliated with, nor are they necessarily customers of Active Navigation. Today's presenters are Chris Dewey and Matthew Wallis, and without further ado, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Matthew Wallis, and welcome to this webinar. I hope all is well in these difficult times, and not got too much cabin fever as we all sit down in front of Zoom and laptop screens and try and get on with work. I'd like to just go through the agenda to start off with. I'm just going to take about 15 minutes to go through some stuff on GDPR and what we should do about unstructured data. And then Chris, is going to take you through a very quick demonstration of the Active Navigation software, which should give you a good idea of the capabilities, what it can do. After that, I'll just wrap up, and then we have time for any questions, and feel free to post any questions throughout the seminar. Anything we cannot answer today, we'll make sure we get back to you and answer in detail. We should only take about 45 minutes of your time, so as they say, sit back, fasten your seatbelts, and sit back and relax. So, first slide. All right, 46% of companies in the past 6 months have had some sort of breach of their data. This is extremely scary. The amount of assets now, a company's worth more from its digital assets now than typically from its physical assets. And we've all seen them, or the companies named in the press, or named and shamed, I suppose. What's going on? BA, breaches, Tesco, Travelex, Dixon's, Equifax is a big, large one we were involved with from an Active Navigation point of view. And the most recent one I think I saw was at EasyJet. Some compromise on data. And I think when this crisis, the COVID situation is driving this more and more. I mean, we're going to go more and more online. The amount of retail that's having to set up quickly web capabilities, online capabilities. So the amount of data flying around is going to be absolutely huge, and the amount of personal information, etc., is going to be absolutely massive. And so, the reputation of companies now will rely on how they govern their data and how they treat the sort of privacy management, data governance of it. It won't just be the regulations, it's going to be the reputation of the company and people capable of wanting to be able to use it. So next slide. This slide, interest point, is taken from a research group called CTRL, a Coalition of Tech Resources for Lawyers, and is done for industry and the education world. And it shows you here the typical type of data you get in a company. Lots of office documentation, lots of stuff from product research, the sales and customer stuff, the HR, etc. You can see it. And as time goes on, the value of this data tends to recede and go away. The IT costs stay relatively stable because we're storing it all and got it somewhere. But the value of the data after 2, 3, 4 years, depending on what it is starting to diminish. However, the risk of perhaps breaches or this being not known where it is increases, and if somebody finds it, it can cause a massive embarrassment. So the problem is not typically where the crown jewels of the company are. Most companies have got this under control and know what's going on from that point of view. It's the stuff that was left around, lying around in some files somewhere, some set of passwords, some set of personal information that everybody has forgotten about and it's just been stowed away. And this is the stuff that the hackers will come in, trawl through the network and find. So the risk to the value gap is dramatically increasing as what we call the ROT, the redundant, obsolete, and trivial data is forgotten about, but is lying around the network, somewhere in the system. These people can find out about it. So we have to do something about this and make sure, from a data mapping point of view, we understand where everything is. Next slide. Okay, there's no secret. There's a huge amount of data being created. In fact, I think it's gotten something estimated to be something like 175 zettabytes present in the world by 2025. A zettabyte is 1 trillion gigabytes. Evidently, if you put these all onto Blu-ray CD-ROMs and stack them on top of each other, they would go to the moon and back 23 times. So we have an unbelievable amount of data. And as you can see from this part of the survey, is obviously most companies have got their structured data under control. It's been around for a long time, and they've got a good policy to look after it. But when we come down to unstructured data, which is going to form a huge part of the data estate, there's about 85% of customers don't have some sort of comprehensive data inventory, or don't know where this stuff is, and some policy to work towards it. So this is going to be a huge problem. People are retaining tons of data that's probably of no use to the company whatsoever, but is sitting there containing some really private or embarrassing information. Next slide. So you don't know, how can you protect what you don't know that you have? I prefer to think about it as a wise old executive told me, if you don't know where you're going, don't be surprised where you end up. So we need a map. We need an approach of, there's lots of different data sets out there. So we need, there's different repositories. So we need a different set of security layers really to look after it. We need a coherent data map and a cohesive interplay between all the tools that can look after it. So we need a governance strategy, data strategy across the whole enterprise. And we have to have different tools that will look after it. Next slide. So on top of perhaps the embarrassment or the customer reputation is the regulatory environment, which is ever increasing. I think with COVID and everybody up to their necks in tactical situations, it's probably sort of perhaps gone to the back of people's minds from that point of view. But regulation is getting more and more onerous. People are starting to understand the need for have some sort of regulated environment around all this data. And so this is going to increase dramatically. You have GDPR, obviously, Article 30 in the European sort of situation. We have things like CCPA in the States, and there's a new one coming in the Middle East, DIFC. Brazil is moving something, India moving on something, Japan is one. So this is going to be ever increasing. And if you're a global company, you're going to have to understand all these different types of regulations and make sure you're prepared to cope with it, because it is going to be companies' absolute responsibility to have a plan and a strategy to defend on this situation. So the regulations are going to become more, as I think the fines are going to be increasingly more difficult, and this is here to stay. And again, with the movement online, this is going to grow dramatically. Next slide, please. So as I said, a typical data estate is a mix, but now we're getting to 80% of the data of an organization is unstructured. And of that, so 33% of it is stale data. If we take typically the customers we tend to deal with, after we've gone through and done all the work on it, we're looking at anywhere between 30 to 40% of the data is what we call ROT, redundant, obsolete, and trivial, and probably could have dealt with. It hasn't been looked at for absolute years and years, and has been forgotten about. So again, this is the dangerous thing. And we're going to have about 50% of organizations are going to have unstructured and semi-structured data, all to be looked after by one data governance program. But it's obviously the ROT and the unstructured data that we're going to concentrate on today. Next slide. I just suppose put it in concept. It's important to look at it, and I said there's sort of several tools for different things. I think it's important to perhaps to try and position active navigation where we fit in a very much a sort of a program strategy and a tool strategy. So if you, this is a Gartner slide that shows you how the privacy management program has to support the security strategy, which has to support the corporate strategy. And we have several modules that contribute to it. We see from that several tools that you tend to need in a complete comprehensive overall approach. So eventually we sit at the file analysis level. We like to think we are the bedrock and the brick that holds everything up. You know, if you don't know where you're going, don't be surprised if you end up. So we need to do an analysis on all the data, do a complete audit, understand where it is, what it is, and what to do with it. Then, as you can see round, you need things like modules to look after data loss prevention. We've got systems looking at cloud access security, information risk, and data-centric audit and protection. So it's a combination of these approaches, and we from our side make sure we can interface to all these systems. But without the file analysis as a starter, we see that as very much where we sit. We need to go in and do a complete audit of the system. And so I think this is a well-accepted slide of how this tends to map out. Next slide, please. So if we take that then from the data analysis point of view, again, this is from Gartner's. It follows us, and very much our product and our approach follows this approach. You need to do your data discovery. What have I got? Where is it? What type is it, etc. Then you need to clean it, understand what is rot, what all the duplications are, and what is highly sensitive. We then need to sort of categorize it, decide what we want to do with it, put taxonomies on it, tag it so we can find it again. And then there's no point in migrating data that's useless and doesn't need to be data. So you need to clean it all before you migrate it. And I think, again, in these difficult financial times, there's going to be a lot of merging of companies, migration of data between companies, and it's going to be very, very important that we have a very clean setup before going on. And then finally, this is a live situation. Once done, we've got petabytes of data being created continuously, and we need to monitor this. And if you've got a global site, you need to consolidate it and bring it in and do a complete analysis of it on an ongoing basis. And this is very much the approach that ActiveNav looks at things from. Next slide. So a little bit about us. This is what we do. We do file analysis. We started out from, we're a British company, started back in 2008, been going for many years, and we eat, live and breathe the file analysis approach. We haven't bought another product from somewhere else and added a bit on to make it do this. This is what we do 24 hours a day. So we have thousands of hours and experience of fixing real content with customers. And that's important because out of this, we have a huge amount of experience. We've developed thousands and thousands of standard rules that you would get out of the box as a customer, which can look at things like GDPR, etc., all the things you're likely to need. In addition, you can then add on custom rules of your own to add to it. But the point is the software can typically be up and running within a few hours straight away looking at the system. As I said, the software is designed for the job. We're continually enhancing it. We have a big R&D group sitting in Winchester, another big group sitting in Washington, United States. And so, again, this is what we eat, live, and breathe. So we've learned it to be pragmatic. And we can come in, some consultants can come in and help you set that up. And it's ultimately deployable across many continents and things, indeed, like the Equifax system, where we have cleansed and looked at 7 petabytes worth of data going upwards, is a very, very good example of this. We have many customers in the US and in Europe. Next slide. Okay, the modules of our system very much can basically expand to do what you want to do. So you can start off with just looking at doing a complete index of the file and doing a skim of what we call of all your data from a content compliance point of view and understand where it is and what is sensitive. We have then a module to help you triage this, get it ready for migration, tag it, etc. So it reduces your migration costs. And then you can go up to all singing, all dancing content governance, which will do a continuous monitoring, will pull in results from different sites across the world, wherever you are, and keep a monitoring approach on that. And each one of these modules is a superset of the next one. So, you know, with intelligent migration, you get the content compliance as well. So we build it up according to what needs you think you're going to have within your company. Next slide. So without more ado, that's enough, I think, from me on just on that quick theory. Hopefully it sets your position of where we sit and of what we do. I'll now ask Chris for the next 15 minutes or so just to go over and give you a very quick high-level demonstration of how we go about this. I want to emphasize that anybody who would like to come back to us on a far more detailed demonstration of what we can do, we'd be delighted to do so. So Chris, thank you everybody, and over to you, Chris. I think you're on mute, Chris.
Sorry, we're fighting between us to mute and unmute me, so apologies for that. So thank you, Matt. So this is what you see when you log into the interface for Discovery Center, the active navigation application here. So it's an on-premise server-based solution, and this interface is only available to nominated users. So you can't just have anybody going into this, because clearly this is going to reveal loads of sensitive information around the organization, and you only want the right people to get access to that. It's all integrated with Active Directory, so there's no extra setup required other than adding usernames or AD groups to be able to access this. And there are 4 different levels of access as well, according to the role that the individuals take when they're working on Discovery Center. So this first page that you see gives a dashboard, a summary dashboard of what's been done to date on your content. So you get to see, for example, a historic view of what's been done over time. And my demo system here is fairly static, so it's stayed the same over the last few months. You can get to look at the different cost levels associated with different areas of content. So you can set tiers of storage and their associated costs and monitor that. You can get a quick summary of the different types of data you have. So here, for example, on the left-hand side, we can see there's some research data, some legacy data, some content from Exchange. So as well as indexing file shares, this will connect to many other types of repository as well, Exchange being one of them, SharePoint and Office 365 being other common ones, but there are many, many more where the connectors available to index that data as well. So you get a quick summary of what's come from which areas. You also get to see what types of file are sitting in this data. So you can see on this pie chart on the right, there's a fair amount of multimedia, video and audio content in this demo data. And you can dig into this in a lot more detail, but this dashboard summary just gives you that quick initial overview, and also shows you the age profile as well. So by created date and modified date. So you can start to see some patterns here. Matt was talking about the value of information declining as it gets older. So these dates actually then become quite useful when combined with other attributes that we extract to help make decisions about that data. So not necessarily that old data is invaluable or has no value, rather. So careful what I say there. But the value declines, and depending what it is, you may or may not choose to apply a retention schedule or clean it up as redundant, obsolete, and trivial. So to get going, we index some data. So I'm going to move across. You see there's some tabs at the top. Each tab controls different parts of the software, and these are switched on or off according to which of those 4 roles I mentioned that you have. So I have access to all the roles here, so I get to see all the tabs. And I'm going to switch over to the indexing tab. This is where we control the software going out to start looking through the data. So creating that data map, that inventory of the data that's there. And it's worth pointing out here that there are essentially 3 types of analysis. So the first is a skim. So I think Matt mentioned that in his intro. The skim is a very light process. It's very fast. It runs at up to 2 million files per hour. And if you skim your data, you can start then running the first stages of the process that Matt showed you and start looking at the discovery of rot and start actioning that. So if you have 30% of your data that has no business value because it's rot, you can locate that really quickly without going into more detailed indexing, which takes longer. So the most detailed level of indexing takes about 10 times longer to do, but obviously compared to trying to do that by hand, it's still extremely fast. So this first level skim runs quickly, gives you initial results that you can use to start cleaning up, and you can control the indexing with configurations. So there are a number of different configurations you can apply. You choose your configuration. So here it's going to be a bit small on your screen, I'm afraid, but hopefully you get the gist. The default skim runs the light analysis, and that generates the rot report. Beyond that, you can start looking at duplication. So there's another level of analysis that looks at exact duplicates. That's about 4 times slower than the skim, but that then helps you look for exact duplicates. So let's just move on and look at what a report looks like once you've done that indexing. So I'm going to generate a report based on an area of interest. Now, the area of interest is something that can be derived from the indexes that you've created. So say you've got 10 indexes, but you have for different content strewn around different locations and maybe in different types of repositories. So this could be something in Office 365, something in a file share, something in Exchange. What you can do is generate an area of interest that dynamically picks from the different indexes that you've generated and maybe subsets of those indexes. So I've picked an example here of HR content, and that happens to be spread around 4 different locations which are referenced within different indexes. So you can very quickly create this area of interest to give you a dynamic reporting structure to make sure you can work on a specific area relative to the business function. So let's create a report. Let's move over to the Report Viewer tab here and define a report view. So I'm going to start with a very simple rot report. So I know we're talking about GDPR here, but just to cover the early stages of this process, because clearly if you can identify and get rid of rot, then you have a lot less data on your hands to go through and investigate in more detail. So it saves you a huge amount of time and effort in review because you're just cleaning out. It's like moving house. You know, you get all the stuff down from the loft. You don't take it all with you. You throw away the stuff that has no value. So apologies for this being a bit small on the screen here, but hopefully you can see along the bottom that there are a number of categories of rot, redundant, obsolete, and trivial, all prefixed by P1, P2, and P3. These are priority, and they relate to our level of confidence. So the P1, the high confidence rules, are those which we believe definitely have no business value and are really not controversial at all. So for example, we have things like redundant temporary and backup files that are 28 days old or more. We have backup files which are more than 90 days old. We have files with nothing in them, 0 bytes. We have copyrighted music, copyrighted video, a whole bunch of stuff that we can go and explore. But all these things are actionable. So unlike other solutions that you may see that offer reporting on things like rot, the rules here are very sophisticated. They are, as Matt mentioned, they are derived from tens of thousands of hours of services delivering this to customers around the globe. So they've been through the mill, and they've been significantly expanded and extended over the years. So anything that you see here, you can right-click and interact with and do something simple like delete. So you can just get rid of that content and mark that in an audit trail, so you can keep a full audit record of what you've done, by whom and when, so that your whole process is defensible in future. So let me just move on quickly. I won't cover all these categories because it's not really the purpose of this session today, but I would just very quickly show you what duplication looks like. You see that as a pie chart. So you see duplicates highlighted, master documents. So imagine you had 10 files which have exactly the same content. So it's all based on a hash value based on the content of the file. If the files are the same, 10 of those files will be marked as a duplication cluster. One will be a master, the other 9 will be duplicates. And again, you can just very simply decide to delete those or quarantine them if you're not quite so confident, if you don't want to go for a hard delete. But if you do delete them, you can also create a shortcut for duplication files, duplicate files when they're removed, that will point through to the last remaining copy of that file. And you can put an annotation in there again to add to that audit trail. So that's very, very rapidly taking you through the first stages of that process of doing the discovery, doing the indexing using the skim, doing some data cleansing, get rid of the rot, get rid of the duplication. And just as a reminder, that can typically, and on average, gets rid of 30% of your content. The best case or worst case, depending which way you look at it, we had a client, they won't mind me naming them, the Royal Navy. They've done case studies on this, that one of their ships came in to be cleansed and went back to sea with just 8% of its data on board. So 92% was cleansed as rot. That's quite a lofty target, so I wouldn't expect to see that again. But the range is obviously there that you can get rid of a whole load of content with this process. So beyond that, then we start to move on to looking at the sensitive data. Now, sensitive can encompass many things. So we're talking about GDPR today. So let's call up a report that shows the sensitive rules that have been applied on this data. And again, you'll see a large number of sensitive categories identified here. Now, this covers, first of all, the personal sensitive, things like the GDPR, PII, but also corporate sensitive. So Matt mentioned reputation. So if you have corporate files which really need to be kept under lock and key, this can help find them, and also look for financially sensitive data as well. So lots of different categories. But if we focus on the GDPR, you'll see there are a whole bunch of rules towards the right hand side here. So we've got biometrics, gender, race, religion, birth certificates, curriculum vitae. We have things like marriage certificates. So many different categories of GDPR. And there are obviously the two levels as well. We have the personal sensitive as well, which needs further controls around it. And the rules have all been written to identify that content and help take it under management. So once you've found these files, you can start exploring them a bit more if you want to. So you see the chart here. The orange bar shows the number of files, and the red dot shows the volume of those files. So in this example, we found some HR data. So we've got 349 files in this sample set, and that's 31.7 megabytes. So don't be too put off by these sizes. This is a small demo data set. This scales to multiple terabytes of content, so even petabytes of content. So Equifax was mentioned as a client. They are currently at, I think, 7 petabytes of data and still going strong. So this is not affected by large volumes. It's built to cope with large volumes. You can see this same data as a table as well. So you see exactly the same data here as a spreadsheet type format. And if you want to go and explore this data, you can then click on the file list. So I've got the date of birth content selected here. I'll click on file list and you'll see a list of files which contain date of birth information. Now, the rules behind this that find this data are really quite sophisticated. So a date of birth is quite hard to find. So you're looking for a date in a document, and first off, dates come in many formats. So we have a rule that will look for a date in 36 different date formats. So the Americanized, the text-based, February 2020, 0220, different ways of writing the date itself. So 02, 2, second, multiple ways of writing a date. So this rule is very sophisticated to look for dates in different formats. Beyond that, we'll then look for some text close by which relates to date of birth. So date of birth, D.O.B. Birth date, lots of different variants of text. And if that's within a set number of characters of the date that we find, that validates that the date we're looking for is not just a random date like a contract signed date, for example. It is actually date of birth. And what that does is then gives us a real high quality set of results. So the results don't contain a high number of false positives. There are lots of validation scripts built into this as well. So if you're looking for things like credit card numbers, it'll do a validation that the checksum is correct. National identity numbers. So for example, if you look for a national insurance number, they're all checked. So they're all very sophisticated rules behind this to make sure you get good quality results. When you've found this data, again, you can action this. So you can right click at any point here. So within the file list, the data table, the chart, and the container list, which I haven't mentioned, that just shows the, in this case, the folders where the content is located. So you could take action at a parent folder level as well if you chose to. So if I right click here, in this case, we found some sensitive data relating to dates of birth. We may choose to migrate that somewhere else. So rather than deleting it or quarantining, it's content that is likely to have a value to the organization, but just be sitting in the wrong place. So it's stray, it's not in the place it should be. So we can choose where to put that. So let's select a secure vault area and select that. There are lots of options then how we can migrate that data. We can take it back under management, annotate it again with an audit trail, and put it where it should be, or under safe lock and key. So one thing that Matt mentioned was about the boundary security, that's opening up, particularly now with more people working remotely. So security is starting to take on a bit of a new meaning, that rather than just thinking about the boundaries and keeping the access to the organization systems secure, there's more thought going into information security. So what content sits within the organization? Is it in the right place? An example, we worked with a local council who had a bespoke system for managing their child protection records, but all the records that were in there, they were great, they were well organized, but all the content that was in there was prepared beforehand in open file shares and uploaded into that system and then just left there. So there was huge amounts of this sensitive data just sitting in open file shares. So this located that by looking for some file IDs, some ID numbers that were found in that data. So we wrote some custom rules that pick out the specific child protection records, then took them under management and made sure they weren't just left exposed in the open file share. Lots of different categories that you can do this with. So HR, I mentioned, you can find HR content and make sure that that is properly managed within the HR department. And all the GDPR type references, so all the personal data, make sure that that's located. So a common approach in applying GDPR is to apply some policy and then ask business users to fill out information asset registers and start putting together registers of records of processing activity. And that requires a lot of interviews and user involvement, and getting people to do that can be quite a challenging thing. And the approach we're taking here is to go out looking for the data that is subject to those controls, subject to that legislation, and making sure we can identify where it actually is located. So you don't forget the data. You don't just think about the things that you've dealt with in the last 6 months. That's a common type of response when people are filling out their information asset registers. They don't think back to the archive data that they just don't have their heads around anymore. So this will find all that data, and then it lets you review that, show reports on it, and take it under management to control it. So once you've looked at migrating the data that you found that's subject to this sensitivity, you can then just keep running this in the background. So the indexes you can schedule to run periodically, and you can then get alerts and notifications sent out to say, for example, we found some new sensitive GDPR data within the reviews area of the content, for example, and that needs to be managed and taken control of. So over time, you can perhaps set some KPIs to say if a certain level of data is found, that you then re-engage and start indexing that again. So a full circular process that can keep on going and keep you on top of locating all manner of data, but here in this context, particularly sensitive data relating to personal GDPR, but many other use cases as well. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Matt.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's super.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much indeed. So just to wrap up, and then we can obviously, if anyone has any questions, pass them through, we can try and answer them. So when would you sort of use this? Obviously, hopefully pre-GDPR regulatory problems from that point of view. But obviously, if you're getting from that issue, if you're very common when we're getting involved with people migrating data to different repositories, or actually, migrating it to different companies, etc. People getting readiness for a breach perspective, assuming they're going to get breached, they know where everything is, making sure that they are compliant to all the rules. And as I mentioned before, we find that 30 to 40% of the stuff we go through it is rot and can be cleaned up. And this can save on storage and all costs, so that could be quite significant. And if you want to get involved with a pilot, we've done a lot of pilot programs for people or proofs of concept, and we're delighted to get involved from that point of view. Next slide. So if I just sort of leave you the classic sort of features and benefits, our approach is that we understand you might start small and grow. The system has been designed to cope with very, very large amounts of data. So this system will scale to typically whatever size you want it to go for. We can hook up, we have a lot of connectors, things like SharePoint, Exchange, Office 365, OpenText, G Suite. I know that question came up on the tabs there. So sort of Google stuff, Confluence, etc. So we have a lot of standard connectors which we have done already. However, we tend to, if there's a custom system which you have we need to look into, we can do that. We can actually get that done as well, because obviously we have to exist in a complete network environment. We're very good at identifying the junk and the duplicate data. It's sensitive. The rules we've written, I think you can really, really rely on. And this is the benefit of us concentrating on this and having had such amount of experience. You can have absolute faith in the system that we've put a lot of time into making the system extremely accurate, so that when it tells you this duplicate, you don't doubt it. And we're seeing, as I said to you before, an average reduction around about sort of 40% plus sometimes of stuff, which can really help from a cost justification point of storage, or at least keep your costs level from an IT perspective. We can do this, look at text in many, many different languages, and we've looked at done some COVID rules in Portuguese, for example, where people need to find documents relating to COVID-19, and on. So we do have very much a global approach, an international approach to this. We can look at over 15 languages now easily. And we comply, so we've developed all the rules for GDPR and CCPA rule sets. And finally, if you put this on your network, it's typically an on-premise system, because we want to be close to the data to give you the enhanced speed. It can sit in the cloud if you want it to. However, we tend to see people sort of putting it on their premise in their systems, because that also helps from a security of the data point of view. But it's very lightweight. It doesn't interfere very much with the performance of the network. And as Chris alluded, especially in the skim initial point of view, from an indexing point of view, it is very, very fast. So literally we can be in there and skimming files in a few hours, so you can get a good idea. In fact, we're delighted to come in and do, if you had a sample piece of data, I don't know, about 500 gigabytes, something you could give us, we could come in and we'll do that and show you a profile of what your data is looking at. And we can do that in a few hours, very, very straightforwardly. So I think that's why I'd like to think you if you're looking at file analysis, data mapping, GDPR and data governance, you need to start with data discovery. So I'd like to think you'd take a look at us and consider us for your business. Final slide then. I think I was going to put this on a t-shirt: map it, clean it, and delete it. It could be sort of interesting for people to think of it, but I think that's a very, very good slogan. Map it and clean it and delete it. And if we follow those rules, I think we'll be in good shape. So let me just say many thanks for listening to us. I hope you found it a useful 45 minutes or so of your time, and you've gained a good overview of our capabilities. I'll talk to Marissa and Eva around this cinema. If you have any questions, we're glad to try and answer them.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Matthew. We did have a couple of questions regarding Google and G Suite, and you had touched on that earlier, Matthew. So we'll move to another question that says, how can you obtain senior or strategic approvals for a project like this?
Well, our experience there is, typically that customers, from a senior point of view, there's obviously the cost justification for saving on storage costs, etc., and not having to increase it. But I think far more at worry for senior execs now is the company reputation. And having seen all these very, very public Vision breaches, as people go online, you don't need, I think senior executives are going to be very concerned about that and fully aware of it. I think the role of the DPO and CTO is going to become very, very, even more important than it is now in driving a company strategy, as an awful lot of people go online.
I would add to that, I think examples of violations are extremely useful. It's all very well talking conceptually, but as soon as you go to an exec and show, well, look at these problems that we found, it becomes quantifiable, and you can then start to, they can start to understand the scale of the problem and why there's a reason to need to do something about it, specifically in their own data.
Chris, do you want to comment on the Google connection at all?
No more than there's a connector for it, so you can index the content that sits in Google Drive. It's there as one of many connectors. Yeah, so not a problem to index the data and update the data that's in situ as well. So something I didn't mention earlier, as well as classifying the data and finding it, you can update certain elements of that data as well. So as well as moving it around, deleting it, quarantining it, migrating it, for certain systems you can update metadata within those files as well. So things like SharePoint, for example, if you want to update the column values in SharePoint, you can do that too through the connector.
Fantastic. And while we're talking about the software, we have a question that says, you mentioned file shares. Can you tell if file shares have been restricted, and what about encrypted files?
So that's a good question. So the software runs using service accounts, and if that account does not have access to the data that you're trying to index, it will come back with a report and tell you areas that it could not access. So you will see in your reports, you can even call out specifically, show me areas where the permissions stopped. So quite often you'll start an index at the top level, you'll get a certain way down, and suddenly the permissions will stop in the subfolders. You can highlight that, you can call that out, and you can then either go back and try and index that with different credentials, so you can put an override in, or you can go and change the credentials on the folder itself, of course, to make it accessible to the account that you're using. And encrypted data, as long as you have the access keys to that data, then you can access that data and index that too.
Great. So we'll circle back to GDPR. There's a question that asks, how global is GDPR, as I believe it only covers EU and North America?
Well, that's a good question too. What you got to remember is that if you have even just one customer within the EU, then you need to be complying with the GDPR rules. So it's not just companies based within Europe that need to be GDPR compliant. It's really all organisations that at least have one customer in the EU, which really, for anything over a tiny company is going to be most organisations. But most countries have their own flavours of it too, and as well as seeing it as the stick of a regulation that you have to comply with, there's also the carrot of looking at the fact that being compliant and treating individuals' data and information with respect is a good thing. So people respect that and want to deal with companies that look after their data and treat it ethically, rather than those that are not taking it seriously. So it makes good sense regardless of the regulation.
Yeah, I think it's a complex situation. There are different rules coming out in different countries, but if you've got one of your entities under GDPR, you have to understand it and make sure you comply with it.
Great. So as we're close on time, we'll take this question as our last one. Are you working with any local government departments or housing services?
Yes, we've done quite a bit of local stuff with local government, looking at stuff also with central government, and also in the United States, we have worked with a lot of government agencies in the civil side and defense side, things like people like the Marine Corps, for example, in the United States, and with local government here. We've also done stuff with blue light organizations here in the UK.
Fantastic. So we are out of time for today, but if you have any questions at all, or as they mentioned, would like to see a more in-depth view of the software itself, please reach out to us. There's an email on the screen there, and you can also visit our website. Thank you again to our speakers, and thank you, of course, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.